the session. Okay, so welcome everybody to the 6th seminar of this series of seminars for the CFTC internship program. So Nuno works in so many different subjects. So last time I asked him to give a more general talk about percolation, and now he will present a very recent topic. Nuno will show us how to use the ancient technique of Kirigami to solve folding at the microscale. So thank you, Nuno, for accepting to talk, and the internet is yours.
Thank you, Cristóbal. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the second subject. And so, as Cristóbal said, for today, I would like to talk about Kirigami, where the idea is to obtain 3D shell-like structures like the one I'm showing you here on the right-hand side from the folding of a two-dimensional template that consists of rigid panels connected through flexible hinges. And as you can see, I call it Kirigami for lazy people, because the idea is to be able to obtain the folded configurations at the microscale, taking advantage of thermal fluctuations. So at the microscale, thermal fluctuations play a relevant role. So the motion of the individual panels will be affected by thermal fluctuations. And the idea is, instead of controlling the motion of the individual parts, as we do at the macro scale, the idea is to take advantage of thermal fluctuations to obtain the folded configuration spontaneously from the random motion of the different panels. There is an advantage of having no control at the micro scale in the sense of no control of the individual degrees of freedom, but the price you pay is that your process is stochastic in nature, and therefore you cannot always guarantee that you obtain the structure that you want to obtain. So there are many questions that are related to the fact that you do it at the micro scale. Some of them, for example, related with misfolding and the likelihood of obtaining the proper structure. But the others are also related with the folding time. So since 2018, together with many collaborators, I've been looking to this problem from these different perspectives. And the results that I would like to show you today is related with the folding time. So how long it takes to fold and how much this folding time depends on the properties of the template that we use to fold, but also on the experimental conditions. And this is something that I've been working with Cristóbal, mainly with Cristóbal Diaz, were the ones responsible for the results that we're showing to you today. So let me start with origami. I think origami is a more familiar concept for all of you. Origami is a Japanese art where the idea is to obtain a 3D structure by folding a two-dimensional sheet of paper. And here I'm just showing you some examples of structures that you can get by folding a paper. Here are just some structures that resemble different animals. Besides being possible to fold the paper, is also possible to cut and to glue. And so you can get much more structures than the ones that you will only get by folding. And I'm pretty sure that all of you have played with something similar to this, a T-shaped template that is supposed to be folded in order to obtain a cube. But as you will see, you can get many different structures. But as I said, I'm interested in looking into Kirigami at the micro scale. So of the different panels, they are no longer made of paper, they will be made of some rigid material, like for example some piece of metal. And what we want is that to see if it is possible to obtain this folded configuration from the random motion of the different panels without the need to somehow control directly the motion of each one of the panels. And the folding has been studied at different scales, but the mechanism of folding strongly depends on the length scale that we are looking at. For example, at the nanometer scale, the interaction between the building blocks is important. There are thermal fluctuations, but the interaction between the building blocks is important. Think, for example, about protein folding. And so the interaction between the atoms or the functional groups will be important. And the kinetics of folding will depend on these interactions and also how they compete with thermal fluctuations. but we believe that the final, or is typically assumed that the final folded configuration is the folded configuration, but the way you arrive there depends on these interactions and also on the thermal fluctuations. If you look to the other side of the length scale, like for example, to the centimeter scale, then the mechanism is significantly different. The building blocks are now rigid panels. The interaction between the panels is mainly excluded volume interaction, contact-like interactions, and the folding is driven by stress relaxation. So the folded configuration is unique, and the trajectories are deterministic. There is no stochastic part on the trajectories. In between, at the microscale, what I mean by microscale is that the panels have sizes of the order of the micrometer. What you have is still, you can assume that the interactions are excluded volume, like at the macroscale, but the motion is driven by thermal fluctuations. And since the interactions are contact-wise, the different panels will only interact when they touch each other. In particular, in the cases that we will be looking at, the edges of each panel are sticky, and so once the edges enter into contact, they will stick together in an irreversible way. So the folding process is driven by a sequence of binding events, and the way these binding events occur in time will define the fate of the structure and will tell us what is the final folded configuration. But this folded configuration is not unique, will depend on the way the system evolves in time. And so the final configuration is a kinetic structure and will strongly depend on the kinetic pathways. And so there are many questions or many challenges from both the experimental point of view and theoretical point of view to study folding at the microscale. From the experimental point of view, one of the challenges is to find strategies to obtain a heterogeneous distribution of the stresses, and in particular to localize where the structure will fold. And there are different strategies being developed. And in particular, if you want to have an idea of one possible experiment, there is a handful of experiments of Kirigami at the microscale, but one I typically have in mind is the one by a group in the Johns Hopkins University, Pandey and collaborators, where they synthesized these panels using a metal. They have some micrometers in size, and they connect them using solder. And so besides having solder in between the panels that are in contact, they also cover the surface of the edges with solder. And so when the template, the two-dimensional template is initially attached to a substrate in a solution where the fluid is moving around. And once they increase the temperature of the system, what will happen is that, but also the solder will melt. And so the hinges between the different panels will become flexible. They will become flexible, and because you have also solder along the edges that are not connected, then they will become sticky. And so when two edges come together, they will bind, and this binding will be irreversible. So this is a possible experiment and how to run some experiments about the problem that I'm talking about. From the theoretical, the first simple question that we can ask is, given a certain three-dimensional structure, and for simplicity here, I will only consider convex polyhedra. Imagine that you have this polyhedra. How can I calculate what are the possible templates that can fold into a polyhedra? And one way to do that is to do a process named edge unfolding, where the idea is to go along the edges and cut the edges connecting the different panels. The problem is that these cuts cannot be done in an arbitrary way. They need to fulfill certain rules. In particular, the final structure should be a simply connected piece. We want to cut it out of a certain 2D material, and we want it to be a single piece in order to avoid the need for different pieces to come together and to assemble into the structure that we want to get. The second is that the unfolding, this two-dimensional template that I also call it net, should be the union of the polyhedron faces. So each of these rigid panels will be the face of the polyhedron in the folded configuration. And the unfolding should not overlap. So the net should not overlap. And the idea is that you can cut it out of a single 2D-like material or quasi-2D material in order to obtain the template or the net for the 3D structure. And so the simplest question we can raise is, does every convex polyhedron have a net? And the answer to this question is, we believe that is yes, but there is no formal proof. And the only reason why we believe that, that the answer is yes is because up to now, nobody has found any convex polyhedrons that has no net, or for which there was not a net that was found. So let's assume that yes, all these structures can have a convex polyhedron. Then the question is, even in the case of the cube, we find 11 two-dimensional templates that can fold into a cube, as you can see in the example here on the left-hand side. And so from all of these, if the trajectories are stochastic in nature, and if we have different possibilities of obtaining the cube, the natural question for the microscale is, what is the optimal net for self-folding? Here in the sense of avoiding misfolding. From these 11 structures, which one is the best one for folding? This is another open question about the system, but no general theory about that. And so we are really looking to a problem of n to 1, where n is the number of possible templates and 1 is the folded configuration that is the cube. The problem is the following. Imagine now that you take a template like the one you have here, and now you connect the edges as suggested by the letters. So this A will connect with A, B with B, C with C, D with D, and E with E. If you do that, what you get is a boat. However, if you now connect them in a different way, B with B, A with A, C with C, D with D, and E with E, what you get in this case, if you connect in this, following these instructions, what you get is an octahedron. And so even starting from the same template, you might get different folded configurations depending on the way that you connect the different edges. And what is being shown both experimentally and the final folded configuration depends not only on the net that we choose, but also on the experimental conditions, like, for example, temperature, and if the temperature changes in time and things like that. So what are the kinetic pathways of folding? What are the possible ways of folding a certain structure? And so what we are really looking at is a problem of n to m, where n again is the number of possible templates, but m is the number of possible folded states. And we don't even have a clue of what is the open questions at the basic level related to this. And so what we decided to do, one of the things, and this is what I'm going to discuss today, is to focus on the folding time. And so for simplicity, what we did was to look into a pyramid of n lateral faces. So now n is the number of lateral faces. And so the advantage of using a pyramid, and in this case, we are using a pyramid that is on a substrate in such a way that it can only fold to one of. With this pyramid, for simplicity, the faces can bind to each other along the edge or even only with a vertex. And so you really know that the final folded configuration is the pyramid. There is no other possible folded configuration. And even this problem is quite difficult to treat from the numerical point of view. You have rigid faces and you need to simulate the motion of the rigid faces. But Cristóbal has found a trick to simulate this in a very efficient way. That was to describe each of these triangles, each of these triangular faces, as a set of 3 different nodes that are positioned at the vertices of the face and only resolve the degrees of freedom for these nodes under confinement due to the fact that they are connected to each other. And this significantly decreased the computational effort that is needed to solve this problem. And when you do that, and you now run simulations for different numbers of lateral faces, what you find is a non-monotonic dependence of the folding time in the number of faces. So as you increase the number of faces, what we see is an initial decrease of the total folding time, the time it takes for the structure to completely fold into the pyramid. And then as you keep increasing the number of faces, this number or this time will increase, okay? And here is in arbitrary units. I can talk about the units later. And so the question, well, it's interesting to see that you have an optimal value around 5, but as physicists, we want to get some insight about the system and try to understand what are the mechanisms responsible for this optimal value at n equal to 5 or around n equal to 5. And so in order to do that, what we did was first to change the way we were describing the motion of the different faces. Instead of focusing on the position of the faces, we define a new quantity that is the angle that the face does with the substrate. And we look into the time series of the angle. And so theta is this angle of the face with the substrate, and I relates to the number of faces. And here I'm showing you a typical plot for the case that we are seeing on the right-hand side, where now the color of the line, so on the vertical axis we have theta, on the horizontal axis we have the time, and the color is related to the face. So we have presented by different colors. The first thing you can notice is that the angle only changes between 0 and pi. 0 corresponds to the case where you have an open structure, two-dimensional open structure, and pi when the face is turned into the inside, so it's folded over the base of the pyramid. And so it's between 0 and pi. And you can see, and I'm marking here a certain region in blue that corresponds to the closing angle of this pyramid. So there is an angle at which, when the pyramid is closed, the faces should be, and this is represented here by this blue region. And since there is some interaction between, short-range interaction between the faces, instead of having a single angle, what I have is a region in the angular space. And so what you see is that what you see with the time series is that as time starts, they all start with the open structure. The faces will move around, and eventually two of them meet at the closing angle. And when they meet at the closing angle, they remain together because they have these sticky edges that I referred to you before. And then eventually the third one joins these two and closes completely the pyramid. When we look to the statistics of this time series, even before the binding events, what we see, and here I'm just plotting one of the quantities that we have looked at, that is the distribution of the angles, what you see is consistent with having a confined random walk in an angular space, confined because the angle can only be between 0 and pi. And so what we have is a confined random walk, but in a very special system. That is, the first time two of them, so we have 3 random walks, one for each face, and the first time two of them meet at a specific angle, that is the closing angle, then they will remain together. So it becomes an absorbing state. And then you have a third one that needs now to find these two in order to close. So we have two different problems when we look to the first closing event and when we look to the second closing event. And in fact, if you think about the problem for n different lateral faces, you see that the first one is a case where the first two need to meet at a specific angle, and after that, the others just need to arrive to this angle that they will immediately stick to the different faces that are, to the other faces that are already closed. So we really have two different processes, one related to the first closing event and the second one related to the second closing event. And so the first closing event, as I was describing, what we need is that two of the random walks meet at a specific space. And so I can represent the problem in a two-space diagram, where in the horizontal axis I have the angle of one face, and then related, this is equivalent of to have a two-dimensional random walk that will move in this space, and they will bind together when they enter into this region. Okay, so what we are looking from the statistics of random walks is a first passage process, is calculating what is the time it takes for a two-dimensional random walk to meet at a specific region of the space. And it's possible to show n times n minus 1 divided by 2 possible pairs of faces that can be the first ones to meet. And so the time for the first closing event should go according to this expression, where n is the number of lateral faces. Here what we have is the logarithmic. So it's something that goes with 1 over the logarithm of the faces. Now, as soon as you have the first two meeting, now you have the possibility to others to join these two. And so what we want to calculate is from the n minus slowest of all these n minus 2. And this is what we did, and you can get again some analytical expression. So what you have now is a set of n minus 2 first passage process in time, and you want to ask what is in 1D, and you want to ask what is the slowest of all these n minus 2, and that scales as logarithmic of n minus 2. So you see that the first closing decays in time as the final one that corresponds to the final closing event will increase in time as the time will increase as a function of the number of faces. So when we put the two together, this is what you have here. Forget for the time being the data points. So what you have here in this purple dashed line is the time for the first closing that goes as 1 over the logarithmic of the number of pairs. And so it decays with the number of faces, again, folding time as a function of the number of faces. And what you see with the green dashed line is the time it takes once the first closing event occurs to the other, from the n minus 2 possible closing events to the last one to occur. And this is, as I said, goes with logarithm of n minus 2. And so the total folding time should be the time it takes for a first closing to occur, plus the time it takes once the first closing occurs to the last. Is the blue line here, the solid blue line here. And so the data points are now simulations for different conditions, in particular different diffusion coefficients of the panels that could be achieved, for example, by changing the temperature of the system. And what you can see is that our theory fits quite well the numerical results obtained. So we are really getting the picture of what is happening here. So it's really, initially for a small number of faces, what we get is a folding that is dominated by the first closing event. This is the process that we take the longest time, and therefore what dominates the total folding time. While when you increase the number of faces, the first folding event is quite quick, but now since you have n minus 2 possible, n minus 2 random walks that need to meet the other two, then the time will increase significantly, logarithmically, with the number of events that you need to have in order to arrive to the last one. So this is just an example of what can be done with folding, but the key message here is that folding is an end-to-end process where you start from n possible templates, and you want to see what are the folded configurations and how long it takes to arrive to them. And that's we can get intuition about what is going on by mapping the problem into a set of random walks. And the advantage of that, but also the next challenge is, if we can map everything into random walks, how can I now extend this to more complex configurations that go beyond the simple pyramidal shape? So, and also that the folding time is a non-monotonic function. Number of faces is really related to these two different time scales and how they depend on the number of faces. So the bottom line is that there are still many open questions, and we will be working on that over the next years. So thank you very much for your time, and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Okay, so thank you, Nuno, for the very nice talk. So we have a few questions. So we have an anonymous that is asking, did you look at two other polyhedrons besides the pyramid? It was not clear to me as to why did choose the pyramid.
Okay, so we have looked into other structures, The problem of other structures is that you have, as I said, m possible folded configurations. Okay, so for example, imagine, let me show you an example here. Imagine that you take any of these templates of the cube. It's not straightforward that you always get a cube. For example, if you allow them to fold to one side and the other, you might fold half of the faces to one side and the other half to the other side. And you will never get the cube because remember I said that the binding between the faces is irreversible. So the advantage of choosing the pyramid is that the pyramid, especially if it is on a substrate, first guarantees that they only fold to one of the sides. And with the pyramid, there is no misfolding. The final folded configuration is always the pyramid. So we avoid misfolding. And with that, we can focus on the folding time. So it was for the sake of simplicity and to avoid any contributions that come, for example, from misfolding and the fact that the structure will never fold into the desired final structure. But it's true, if we want to learn a bit more about this problem, we need to go to more complex structures. And in particular, another advantage of the pyramid is that initially all faces are equivalent. While if you look here to the templates of the cube, the faces are different. And you can even have different generations of folding. What I mean by different generations of folding, imagine that you take the T-shaped template. These first four will fold, so you get a cube that have an open lip. And so the second folding will be different from the initial ones. And so if you try to map this into random walks, you need to know what are the hierarchies of all these random walks and how they depend in time and when they become relevant, because, for example, the second folding to occur requires that the first one already happened. So we need to take that into consideration.
Okay, so thank you, Nuno. So one possible question would be the applications of this theory directly to experiments or to
that's interesting. So there are several applications being discussed. So in general, I did not spend so much time talking about applications, but this is in fact an interesting point. People have been looking to that for different reasons. The first one is saying, okay, if I can fold, what I can do is that I can do drug delivery by protecting or covering a certain drug that I want to deliver to a specific space with a different material. So, for example, this will be a way of encapsulating, is the way they call it, encapsulating a drug at the microscale without the need to go there and fold it like we do, for example, with a gift with paper. This is one possible application. Another one is related with the story of shape-changing materials. What we want is to develop a class of materials that by changing some property, like for example, temperature or activating some binding between the faces or whatsoever, change the shape of the material. And this is used in nature quite often in different cases. Like for example, in a pineapple, for example, to open the seeds of some plants, you use strategies like that, but you can also find, for example, earwigs that are insects that go under the soil and they only come outside quite rarely, so they need to fold and unfold their wings, and they do it using folding strategies. And so inspired by that, people have been developing, for example, soft robots or other structures that fold and unfold depending on the external conditions. But now if you try to go into the microscale, this folding and unfolding process will be affected by thermal fluctuations. So we believe that provided that the interactions are contact-wise, many of the ideas that we are developing in this context can be extended to understand those systems.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions from anonymous. So the first question is, what is again the variable that follows a Brownian motion distribution?
Okay, so maybe I was not so clear. The variable that we look at the general coordinate of the problem. So basically it's the angle between the face and the substrate, okay? So as many of you have seen, for example, in analytical mechanics, you need to see what are the degrees of freedom and try to see what are the variables that correspond to those degrees of freedom. And in this case, is the angle, one of the set of variables that we can look at is the angle between the face and the substrate. So it's really this angle theta. But what that means is that if it is a Brownian motion, means that the motion of the face is described or is consistent with a Brownian motion around the edge with which is sticked to the substrate. So any variable that can describe this motion will correspond to a Brownian motion, provided that you are in the proper scale. Yeah.
Another question is it worth to work with open structures like the cube, but without one of the face?
Well, this is something that can be done. In particular, what that will do is decreasing the number of, from the theoretical point of view, we will decrease the number of possible templates that lead to that structure. In another paper, I wrote a citation somewhere in my slides, but I did not discuss that. We have looked into that. What are the structures that can be obtained when we remove one of the faces and how this affects the folding process. But there is no problem with that, provided that you have a certain structure that you can unfold and form and obtain a net, then you can do it with this type of strategies. The problem becomes when, for example, you look, I was only looking to convex polyhedron. When you go to concave polyhedron, when you have something that goes to the inner side, then it's not necessarily true that you will find a net in 2 dimensions that can fold into that structure. But provided that you can fold that, that you can find such structure, you can use the same set of ideas. And what is interesting is you can imagine a structure, and the technique that is commonly used, for example, in computer graphics, is to discretize every surface as a set of triangles. And so you can start from that, from any object, discretize the surface using a set of triangles, and think about if it is possible to find an open structure that you will fold into that object. If you find that, then you, in principle, you could think about developing strategies to obtain the structure from the random motion of the faces. I'm not guaranteeing you that the likelihood that you will obtain without any other control over the system, it's high, but in principle you can do it. And one of the things that we plan and we are starting to look at is ways to control the folding process with the minimum intervention in order to drive the system towards the target structure that we want to obtain.
Okay, so we have another anonymous question. So when you plot the plot that compares the theoretical expression with the numerical results, the person is asking if the simulations were from a random walk on an angular space or not.
Okay, so you are, I think the question is about the final plot. So
yes,
let me move there. So in this case, the numerical results are for direct numerical simulations of the faces. I'm not using random walks here. Random walk is something that I get from the statistics of the faces. But the different dots are for different diffusion coefficients and also different angles, as you can see here. The 1, the 2, and the 3 are sets of simulations with different angles. The way to correct the angle as a first approximation is to divide the time by theta square, because where theta is the closing angle. In this case, 5 pi over 6, then 3 pi over 4, and 2 pi over 3. Why? Because if you have a diffusive process, the first thing that you can assume is a simple assumption and needs to be verified in certain limits, but the simplest thing that you can assume is that the time will scale with the region that the random walk needs to explore in the angular space until it finds this place. And while in a ballistic process, we say that the distance scales linear in time, if you have no acceleration in the process, if you have a diffusive process, then is the square of the distance that scales linear in time. And that's why we divide by theta square in order to have a data collapse of data obtained with different angles.
Okay, so thank you, Nuno. We don't have any more questions. So I would like to thank Nuno for his presentation, and we'll call tomorrow for the next webinar.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.